Grant Holloway thought he was running toward hope. What he ran into instead was a crime already in progress. The call came just after midnight. Elijah's condition has worsened, the doctor said. You need to come now. Grant didn't wait for details. Sirens cut through the empty Atlanta streets as his driver sped from Buckhead toward Emory University Hospital. His 6-year-old son, Elijah, had been fighting a rare infection for weeks, an illness that left him weak, feverish, and drifting in and out of consciousness. Every hour mattered. Every breath felt borrowed. At the hospital, Elijah lay small and fragile beneath a tangle of wires and monitors. The steady beep of the heart machine was the only proof he was still holding on. Standing at his bedside earlier that evening had been Bria Johnson, Elijah's caregiver. Quiet, attentive, the only person who noticed the smallest changes in the boy's breathing, the brief tremors in his fingers, the way his eyes fluttered just before he slipped into restless sleep. And watching from the doorway had been Madeline Price. Grant's fiancée had worn the right face for the nurses, worried, composed, devoted. But Bria had seen something shift in her eyes when she thought no one was paying attention, attention that didn't belong in a room meant for prayer and waiting. Bria felt it before she understood it. An hour later, as Grant rushed toward the hospital through red lights and rain-slicked streets, Madeline told the nurses she would sit with Elijah for a moment. Bria was asked to step out. The door to Elijah's ICU room closed softly behind her. Inside that quiet room in Atlanta, where a sick little boy fought to breathe, a decision rooted in a buried past was about to be made. By the time Grant reached the ICU doors, would he be arriving as a father in time, or as a witness, too late? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The sound of Grant's footsteps echoed like thunder through the hospital corridor. He didn't wait for an escort. He didn't ask questions. He just ran. He rounded the corner into the ICU, heart pounding harder than it ever had in any boardroom or business deal. What he saw through the glass of room 12B froze the blood in his veins. Madeline, his fiancée, the woman he trusted with his son's life, was standing over Elijah's bed. A thick hospital pillow was pressed firmly over the boy's face. For a moment, time fractured. Elijah's small legs kicked. The heart monitor shrieked in sharp, jagged spikes. The room spun in slow motion. And then Grant moved. "Get away from him!" he bellowed, bursting through the door. Madeline jumped back, startled but not fast enough. Grant shoved the pillow off Elijah's face as his tiny body went limp. "No!" Bria screamed from the hallway. "Help! Help!" The beeping monitor flatlined for a half-second, sharp, deadly. Then the room erupted with movement. 2 nurses rushed in, slamming the red emergency button. One began chest compressions while the other prepped the oxygen tank. Bria's voice cracked in the hallway, calling out Elijah's name like a prayer caught between panic and faith. Madeline stood frozen, her hands trembling, mascara streaking her cheeks. I was just calming him," she cried. The nurse forced oxygen through the mask. Elijah's chest rose, then fell, then rose again. A wet cough rattled from his lungs. The monitor began to beep again, weak, erratic, but there. He was breathing, just barely, but breathing. Grant dropped to his knees at the side of the bed, his hands shaking as he reached for his son's fingers. Elijah's eyelids fluttered, skin pale and damp. "Thank you, God," Grant whispered through clenched teeth, his forehead resting on the mattress. He didn't even realize he was crying until the tears dropped onto the sheets. A second later. Just 5 seconds later. 5 seconds later. And this would have been a different story. Behind him, security entered the room and restrained Madeline, who had collapsed to the floor, sobbing and screaming in denial. She kept shouting the same sentence, over and over. I was trying to help, but no one was listening. Bria stood by the door, her face pale as ash, her hands still shaking. She looked at Grant, eyes wide and wet with horror. She was killing him, Bria whispered. She was really killing him. Grant couldn't speak. He stayed on his knees, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. His body was present, But his soul was still catching up to what God had just stopped. He looked at Elijah's face, fragile, bruised, alive. It should have ended, right there. It should have ended. But something bigger had stepped in. Something greater. Something holy. God had interrupted evil. And as the nurses continued stabilizing Elijah, and Madeline was led away in handcuffs, one question echoed in the silence. Why would a woman who claimed to love him try to kill his son? The sound of the recording device clicked on. Harsh fluorescent lights beamed down onto the metal table where Madeline sat, her hands folded tightly in front of her, wrists trembling ever so slightly. Across from her, two detectives stared her down in silence. "State your full name for the record," the lead detective said. "Madeline Brooks," she answered, her voice low but steady. "No," the detective replied, sliding a file across the table. "That's the name you gave when you moved here. But it's not the name you were born with." Her eyes flicked up just for a moment, but that moment was enough. Behind the mirrored glass, Grant stood with his arms folded, his face unreadable. He had heard that name before, the name she abandoned, the identity she buried. But until now, it had been nothing more than a whisper in his gut. The file lay open in front of the detectives. Inside, a photo from a foster care intake report, a fingerprint match, and a legal name tied to a sealed juvenile record. "You've been lying for a long time," the second detective said. "Changing your identity doesn't erase what happened. It just delays the reckoning." Madeline's mouth parted slightly. Her eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. She turned her face away from the camera, toward the wall, still silent. Outside, Grant's mind reeled. Everything he thought he knew had shattered within 48 hours. The woman he once pictured standing at the altar was now under fluorescent lights, fighting to hold a lie together as it cracked apart in her hands. Bria stepped into the hallway beside him, her expression just as haunted. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. "Something I didn't say before." Grant turned slowly. He could already feel the weight coming. "There were other times," she confessed. "Times when Madeline insisted on being alone with Elijah. Even when I offered to stay, she said she needed time with him. Just the two of them." She looked down. "And I didn't push back, because you trusted her, and I didn't want to overstep." Grant said nothing. His silence said enough. He'd handed Elijah over to someone he thought was safe, someone he loved, and in doing so, he had ignored what God had been quietly nudging all along. Something was off. Something was hidden. And now, the truth was bleeding into the open. What hides in darkness always trembles when light arrives. The detectives continued pressing Madeline inside the room. "Why did you lie about your name? What were you running from? Who were you before you became Grant's fiancée?" But she said nothing, still gripping the edge of the table, still pretending she could hold back the flood. Grant watched her carefully. And for the first time, he didn't see confusion or fear on her face. He saw shame. And shame doesn't grow from nothing. Shame grows from sin buried deep, until the light comes to dig it up. Everything was unraveling now, not just because of law enforcement, but because God had decided enough was enough. The veil had been ripped open, the lie exposed, and yet the biggest question remained. Who was Madeline before she became his fiancée? The records clerk moved carefully, almost reverently, as she handed over the sealed file. A red stamp "Confidential" stretched across the top, its ink faded but still firm. The detective signed for it, offering a quick nod before retreating into the silence of the cold records room. Detective Ronson didn't open the file immediately. He simply stared at the cover for a moment, as if the weight of what lay inside could be felt through the folder alone. When he did open it, he exhaled slowly. There it is. Behind the glass of the observation room, Grant sat motionless. His fingers were laced together. His foot didn't bounce. He didn't fidget. He waited. The pages flipped softly as Ronson read the report aloud, his voice quiet but clear. Madeline Brooks, then registered under the name Mara Lynn Carter, was placed in a group home at age 16. History of instability, noted signs of manipulation and emotional detachment. Behavioral reports, multiple warnings. He turned another page. She was assigned responsibility for a younger child, a 5-year-old boy named Julian. The child was under her care during nighttime shifts when staff levels were low. Bria stood in the corner, arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw clenched. Ronson paused, his voice growing heavier. One night, Julian was found unconscious at the bottom of a staircase. Bruised, malnourished, internal bleeding, spinal trauma. He survived, but he never walked again. Bria let out a soft gasp. Ronson continued. The state opened an investigation. Madeline was questioned, but her foster guardian secured a private settlement. The boy's family never pressed charges. The case was sealed. She vanished not long after that, changed her name, moved across the state, rebuilt her life. He closed the file with a sharp snap. Until now, in the hallway outside the division office, Grant stood up and pressed his hand against the window pane. His reflection stared back at him, older, heavier, not in body but in soul. "How did I not see this?" he whispered. Bria stepped beside him, her voice soft. "You weren't supposed to." She built a new life, designed to fool anyone who cared enough to look. "But God looked," Grant said, "and he's pulling every hidden thing into the light." The pain in his voice was quiet but not aimless. It had found direction, purpose, because now he saw what connected the past to the present. A vulnerable boy, left in her care, a sudden collapse, a panic she claimed to have, a life nearly taken, twice. Sin doesn't disappear. It only waits for its season. 1. Grant leaned against the wall, his breath shallow. Julian had lived, but he would never walk again. And now Elijah, his own son, had come within a breath of the same fate. It couldn't be coincidence. It couldn't be just a terrible mistake. Not anymore. The evidence was speaking. The past was repeating, and something darker was threading it all together. One question gripped Grant's heart like a vice. Was Elijah targeted because of what she did years ago? The break room felt colder than usual. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of what lingered in the silence. The hum of the vending machine filled the empty space, and the weak overhead light flickered, casting shadows on the tile floor. Bria sat at the corner table, her fingers wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She hadn't touched it. Across from her, Grant waited quietly. He hadn't pressed her. He hadn't asked questions. He just sat with the weight of the unspoken between them. Finally, Bria exhaled. "I noticed it," she said quietly. "A few weeks ago. Maybe longer." Grant turned to her, his brow furrowing. "The meds," she continued. The timing didn't make sense. Elijah's prescriptions were logged one way, but his reactions told a different story. Sudden fatigue, weakness, headaches. I reviewed the dosage records, but nothing jumped out as illegal or obvious. She paused. Still, I felt it, deep down, like a knot I couldn't untie. Grant remained silent. "I would watch Madeline request alone time with him," she said, her voice cracking. "She always had a reason, a story, something sweet. 'He needs to bond with me,' she'd say, or 'I want to be the one who calms him down.' And I let her." Tears welled in Bria's eyes. She looked down at the cup. "I didn't have proof, just instincts. And in a hospital, instincts don't hold up against charts and access codes." Her voice broke. "So I prayed." She looked up, her eyes now filled with something deeper than guilt, grief. "Every night, I went home and prayed. Not the kind of prayers you say out loud, not the ones you write in journals. I just whispered, 'God, please, please, protect him. Please don't let anything happen while I sleep. Please cover what I can't see.'" Her voice faded to a whisper. "I begged him." Grant's eyes glistened. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, not in anger but in reverence. Because suddenly, the survival of his son didn't look like a coincidence. It looked like an answered prayer. He spoke softly. While the doctors fought with medicine, someone was fighting with faith. Bria covered her mouth, the sob escaping before she could stop it. "I should have done more. I should have spoken up sooner." Grant leaned forward, his voice firm but full of grace. "You spoke to the one who mattered most." They sat in silence for a moment. letting the weight of it all settle. Outside that small break room, the world went on. Doctors walking the halls, machines beeping, lives being saved or lost with every second. But here, in this quiet corner, something sacred had happened. God had heard prayers Bria never dared speak aloud, and he had moved, not with lightning, not with fire, but with perfect, silent precision. He had covered Elijah. He had intervened, and even when Grant had been blind to the truth, he had not been. Still, a question hovered in the room, refusing to disappear. Because prayer may have rescued Elijah, but the sickness wasn't random. The patterns weren't coincidence. The storm hadn't been natural. So Grant asked what they were both now afraid to voice. Did Madeline actually make Elijah sick on purpose? The walls of the infectious disease unit were painted in soft grays and gentle blues, an attempt to soothe what could never really be softened. Truth, especially when it arrived clothed in science but rooted in something far deeper. Dr. Helen Tran stood at the end of a long conference table, holding a slim report in her hands. Grant sat across from her, Bria by his side, both of them bracing for the kind of clarity no one truly wants. Dr. Tran began, her voice even. We've completed a full toxicology panel on Elijah's blood work. The results are uncommon. Grant leaned forward. Uncommon how? The presence of a rare compound, she replied, laying the papers on the table. An immunosuppressant, very powerful, not designed for pediatric use. In fact, it's tightly regulated and typically reserved for adult organ transplant recipients. Bria's hand went to her mouth. But Elijah hasn't had any transplant. He's never even needed one. Dr. Tran nodded. Which is why its presence in his system is deeply alarming. We didn't just find a trace, we found evidence of prolonged exposure. Someone didn't just make a mistake. They introduced it repeatedly. Grant's heart began to pound. We cross-referenced the administration times with Elijah's symptoms. Dr. Tran continued. His worst downturns. They align perfectly with the compound's toxicity arc, meaning someone gave it to him intentionally and in increasing doses. Grant was quiet. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair. How could that have happened? Who would even have access? Dr. Tran lifted another document. Only 2 people had security clearance to access the medication vault in that wing. Yourself and Madeline. Bria gasped. Doctor. Tran's tone dropped. You never signed any pull requests, but Madeline's badge was used 7 times, each within hours of Elijah's steepest crashes. Every time she requested privacy. Every, I need time alone with him. It wasn't just emotional. It was calculated. The room went still. No more guessing. No more wondering. Medicine had spoken, and what Faith had long feared was now medically confirmed. This wasn't an accident, Grant whispered, his voice hoarse. It was an answered warning. He stood slowly, the report trembling in his hand. His legs moved on instinct, carrying him back down the hallway, past nurses and beeping monitors, past the glass doors that led into Elijah's room. His son lay sleeping, still fragile, still healing but alive. Grant stepped closer, dropped to one knee, and rested a hand lightly on Elijah's arm. For the first time, there were no words left to say, no accusations to speak. Instead, he bowed his head and whispered his first real prayer. God, I know I've been blind. I know I let the wrong people in, but thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for covering him when I didn't see. I'm here now, and I'm listening. The machines beeped softly beside him, and for a moment there was peace. Not because the pain was over, but because the truth was no longer hidden. Still, one thread remained, because now they had the proof. Now they had the pattern, but not yet. The confession. Grant opened his eyes, watching Elijah sleep. Will Madeline finally admit the truth? The room was quiet, not the kind of silence that offered peace, but the kind that pressed in like a weight. Concrete walls, metal chair, no clock, no noise. Just the ticking of guilt in the heart of a woman who had nowhere else to run. Madeline sat across from Detective Ronson, her hands folded neatly, as if pretending for just a moment longer that she still had control. But her shoulders betrayed her hunched forward, trembling beneath a carefully built facade now crumbling by the second. "This is your chance," Ronson said calmly. "We already have the medical records, the access logs, and your badge history. What we don't have is your voice. What we don't have is why." Behind the mirrored glass, Grant stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the woman he had once trusted to raise his son. Madeline swallowed hard. Her voice came slowly like something torn loose. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Ronson said nothing. He let the silence demand more than his voice ever could. Madeline glanced toward the mirror, not knowing Grant stood on the other side. "When Elijah started getting sick, I thought it would pass. Kids get sick. But when it got worse, I panicked. I thought, what if the tests show something? Something I can't explain." Her voice cracked. "What if someone looks deeper and finds me?" She took a breath, shallow and shaky. "I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted to protect the life I'd finally built. The one where I wasn't Mara Carter anymore. Where nobody knew what I did to that boy." Ronson leaned forward. "So instead of facing the truth, you tried to erase the evidence. I thought if he—" She stopped herself, her lips trembling. Her head dropped into her hands. "I thought it would all disappear with him." Behind the glass, Grant's jaw clenched. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He just watched. Because now, it was all laid bare. Evil didn't always scream. Sometimes it planned. Sometimes it smiled while it poisoned. Sometimes it held a child's hand and lied through its teeth. Madeline lifted her head again, her face wet with silent tears. "I loved him," she whispered. "I swear I did. But I loved my secret more." And there it was, the confession. The turning point no lawyer could repair. The truth that could not be undone. Ronson slid a written statement across the table. "Sign it." She reached for the pen with trembling hands, knowing it wouldn't save her. Nothing would, because truth had finally caught her, and the darkness she'd lived in for so long had been lit by something stronger than her lies. "You can run from your past, but you can't outrun truth." She signed her name this time. The real one. On the other side of the glass, Grant turned and walked away, his footsteps slow but sure. Not because he was free of the pain, but because he had finally seen the full shape of it. Now came the question no one wanted to answer aloud. What kind of justice will follow a crime meant to stay buried? There were no reporters outside the courthouse. No flashing cameras. No questions shouted down marble steps. Inside, the courtroom was nearly empty by design. A sealed session, closed to the public. No media, no microphones, no drama. Just a judge, 2 attorneys, a grieving father, a watching caregiver, and a woman whose lies had finally met their end. Madeline stood at the defense table, her posture straighter than expected, but her face worn down by the slow erosion of truth. The mask she had worn for years no longer fit. Her hands were cuffed, her eyes stayed forward. The clerk read the charges without flourish. Count 1, attempted murder of a minor. Count 2, child endangerment resulting in lasting harm. Count 3, identity fraud in connection to a sealed juvenile case. There were no objections, no jury, no appeals. The defense had already folded. She had confessed, and now she would answer. From the back row, Bria sat with her hands clasped in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But tears welled as she watched justice rise, not with a roar, but with still, unstoppable authority. The judge, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, spoke with sobering calm. "This court acknowledges the deliberate harm done to a child under your care, and the pattern of deception used to conceal prior abuse. The court recognizes the bravery of those who spoke up, and the protection extended by forces beyond what man alone could see." He paused, gaze steady. "Madeline Brooks, formerly known as Mara Carter, you are sentenced to 25 years in a state correctional facility, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Your sentence begins immediately." He struck the gavel once, not loudly, but with enough weight to echo through the silence. It was done. There were no cheers. No applause, just a sacred stillness. Because some justice doesn't need a crowd. God does not need an audience to be just. Madeline was led from the room without resistance. She didn't look back. At the prosecution table, Grant sat still. The judge handed him a final set of documents: the custody confirmation, the guardianship reassignment, the legal closure of a storm that nearly claimed his son. He signed with a steady hand, not from peace, not from joy, but from resolve. Justice had arrived. Quiet, firm, complete. Bria stood in the back, her body trembling. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was relief. She watched Grant rise, and when their eyes met, she nodded wordlessly, thankful. Because even without headlines, without cameras, and without public vindication, truth had won, justice had landed, and heaven had seen every part of it. The halls of the Children's Recovery Center didn't echo like a hospital. They whispered like a chapel. Soft footsteps, gentle voices, light filtered through high windows as if even the sun had been told to tread carefully here. Elijah sat in a small therapy room, his legs dangling off the padded bench, working to squeeze a stress ball with his left hand. The therapist watched patiently, offering encouragement. Every movement was a battle, every inch of progress, a quiet victory. Bria stood just outside the glass door, clipboard in hand, but her focus entirely on the boy. Her legal badge now read Certified Pediatric Care Specialist, but it wasn't the title that mattered, it was the trust. She had earned it, with fire and prayer. Grant had rearranged everything. Sold one of his Buckhead properties. Closed down 2 office floors. Moved into a modest home just 12 minutes from Elijah's care center. Nothing extravagant. No skyline view. Just windows wide enough to let peace in. Because that was all he wanted now. Peace, stability, proximity. At the Faith and Trauma Counseling Clinic, Grant and Elijah now had their own hour each week. The sessions weren't always smooth. Some days Elijah barely spoke. Some days he'd cry for reasons even he couldn't explain. Other days, he'd draw pictures of dark rooms and brighter doors, stick figures holding hands, fire turning into light. Healing wasn't fast. It wasn't clean, but it was real. Grant listened more now. He didn't try to solve every silence. He sat in it. Let Elijah feel safe in it. And when the therapist once asked Elijah, "What makes you feel most okay?" the boy answered, "When Daddy stays in the room." Back home, the routine had changed. Bria managed Elijah's care schedule, medications, appointments, therapy prep. She coordinated everything, but never took over. Grant was there for every milestone. Some nights, Elijah still woke up crying. He would call out into the dark, breathing fast, the shadows of memory clinging to him like smoke. Grant would be there in seconds. He never left the house anymore without telling his son where he'd be. And most nights, he didn't sleep in his bed. He slept in the recliner next to Elijah's. Bible in hand, slippers on, blanket folded neatly by his side. The lamp stayed on, just in case, because some parts of healing don't happen in the daylight. Some nights, Elijah would stir and instead of fear, he'd find his father's silhouette in the chair. Still, present, praying. One evening, after a longer than usual therapy session, Elijah managed to stand on his own for a full 20 seconds. No one applauded, no one shouted, but Bria cried quietly in the doorway. Grant knelt beside him, holding his hand, and Elijah, breathless but smiling, whispered, "I did it." It wasn't loud, but it was holy, a slow miracle, not the kind that comes in fire and thunder, but the kind that walks back through pain, step by trembling step, learning to breathe again, to trust again, to live again. Sometimes, God doesn't heal us all at once. He teaches us how to walk again with the scars.